set positions and the most significant contributions in all the different aspects that have been dealt with during this symposium. But when there's an air crash, so an airline has a speaker, a spokesperson, and the airport has a spokesperson to speak on behalf of the airport or the manufacturer. Will also have a spokesperson to speak on behalf of the company. But what we do not have is someone to speak on behalf of 100, 200 people that were probably traveling inside that airplane that crashed. So from that moment onwards, we have a dynamic that also in the case of the media, which is very... sometimes it's crazy because during the first hours we want to get the most evident information, which are the victims, and this is the moment when this should be stressed the least from the media, and this is exactly when they need the support from the media. The time has passed by, and the media usually have forgotten the victims and the families, especially when everything has happened. So, and some journalists, fortunately, make this become their personal battles. But there are many gaps in time after this development of an air crash, and then after the end of the time of air crash. This is true that the organizational part is prepared, is ready sometimes, not always, but sometimes we have seen in some crisis situation. But should we think from the information point of view of changing this reality that seems inherent to when the people are looking for answers that we cannot give, and when we press the victim that should not be receiving pressure? I think this was of the main consequences at the very first moment when journalists went to Barajas, to the airport in Madrid, because they were obeying the managers, and most of them, so we are talking about the Spanair crash. Some of the journalists that came to the airport had not been working for 1 month. They had not even 1 month experience working. So they firstly talked to the primary sources of information. The primary sources of information are the ones that help us reconstruct what has happened, or a part of what has happened. And the primary sources of information were the relatives that didn't know. That's a bad practice in journalism. But also, regarding what you have said, sometimes the victims have no spokesperson. The problem is at this moment, it's not only that they didn't have a spokesperson, they were refused the storytelling. They could not tell any story that could make them human, not only the victims, but also the relatives or the families. That was the main deficit that the big media, the radio, the television stations, but also the big journals, the big newspapers in Spain. And from that deficit, they suffer a lot. The voice was never given to the victims. The floor was never given to the victims.
I think when we think about incident response and looking after families, it's important to note that they all have their individual stories, as my colleague already raised. But one thing that's very important for families is that often when they're in the midst of an incident, it becomes a media fanfare. And they can actually become very vulnerable to exploitation during an incident. So I think, although they need to be able to tell their stories, a lot of families are actually grieving. It's grief is the price we pay for loving. And I think at that point, it can be a deeply private and internally distressing time for families. So I think, yes, there must be access to the media. Yes, I don't think we should restrict families if they choose to speak to the media. But equally, there needs to be protections towards families against, as my colleagues already raised, lawyers and litigation firms who want to exploit the situation, but also protections put in place for family members and survivors from the media to have a more of a controlled measure put in place so that we can protect them as well and allow them time to process what's happened to them and their family members, but most importantly, empower them enough to be able to navigate their way through a deeply distressing time.
Alessandra.
Thank you. I'm actually going to ask two of my panelists the question that you've almost asked me. I think for Tim, we're never going to be able to control how much experience a journalist has on the scene. We're never going to be able to control the pressures that they're under to break a story or that editorial pressure that they may face. So I think it's almost impossible for us to try. But to ask Otti, do we provide training? Do we provide a briefing for victims and their families at the beginning to say, here are the basic rules. When you do speak to the media, here are the watch outs. This is what you need to do. Because I think without it, it's almost uncontrollable in terms of what the journalists are doing.
Absolutely.
Sorry to bounce back to you.
It's a very good point. So I think there needs to be sort of a dual response to that. So the first one is about how we ourselves as responders actually navigate our relationship with the media. I think there needs to be more resources placed on relationship building within the media infrastructure when an incident does happen. So giving them a means to, like a telephone call to get like direct communication in terms of press releases. There needs to be a direct person or a group of individual crisis comms experts who then will manage that complete piece with the media and become almost a spokesperson, the intermediary between the family members and also the media. And then I think you made a really good point there about training for family members and survivors, because they've gone from being normal individuals to then being on the front pages of newspapers sometimes, or their family members, a name trending on social media, but not for any good reason, but often because they've been injured or lost their lives. So I think you make a good point that there needs to be a level of training and understanding for them so that they can make informed decisions about who they engage with, if they even choose to engage with the media on a personal level.
Teresa.
Bueno,
So regarding that question, I would answer with two examples. In the case of the when the air crashed by Spanair, there was some operators that knew exactly what had occurred. The airport manager knew, the manager of air navigation knew this, and of course the person directing the airport, they had the information. How should they have had provide this information with a single operator, with a single spokesperson, in order to specify exactly what had happened? Because we have to remember that was a day, people coming back from holidays. Nobody knew whether it was true, and nobody knew which flight was the one affected, and it was a wave of panic. Everybody was panicking. So when we are certain that there was an air crash, some people have to provide information absolutely immediately. But why do they don't do this? This is something that we have to answer. Let's say something that happened in connection with the accident by Spanair. This was a casualty, this first case that we have about the technical cause that we had. So the first cause came from a journal from the United States that was the manufacturer of the origin of the manufacturer of the plane. Why? When we have some information, many times this is not because of an altruistic cause. And when we had the German Wing air crash, at the beginning we didn't know what had happened with the plane. So that's why I used the example of the prosecutor from Marseille. And so he was compelled by the law, he said, to tell what had happened in a case of a big disaster. He was updating the information on a daily basis, sometimes even though he didn't have new information, in order to avoid new speculations. Tim?
opportunity. Thank you. So a few points there, very interesting points that were made. On the question of the experience of journalists, that's a very interesting point. I think it comes down to the culture of the organization they work for. That's really where it starts. All journalists, even me, when I write an article, it gets edited by somebody. Everybody has an editor, and on a very complex story like an air accident, an organization like mine would mobilize quite a lot of people. There would be quite a lot of oversight of what is going on. The reporter on the ground is just one part of a complex organization. Their work will be edited. How they behave on the ground towards victims' families and authorities and so forth, I mean, that's going to depend on individual circumstances. I would like to think that anyone who works for us would know roughly what to do, and they would, if they just started, they would be on a pretty tight leash. One thing I would perhaps say is that, as I mentioned, there are fewer and fewer aviation specialists. In countries with a lot of aviation, where, it can be useful for the investigation agency or the airport or the local airline or transport ministry know who the journalists are who might cover an accident. This is part of your accident preparation. Have a relationship with them, have their phone numbers, bring them in, tell them about Annex 13, why it exists, what is possible, what is not possible. Explain the process. And the reason for that is the most difficult thing, especially for broadcast media and so forth. But, in the hours after an accident, there's just this empty space that needs to be filled, usually with uninformed speculation. So the more you can say that is rooted in facts, and real knowledge, the better. And sometimes that can just be explaining, we really don't know what's happened here. This is how the investigation will work. This is who's responsible for it. This is what, all of that stuff is useful information. It helps to calm the situation. It's factual. It doesn't necessarily take the story forward immediately, but it is all part of sort of filling in the gaps in the picture. And the other point was, I'm sorry, I can't remember. Oh, yes. A spokesperson for the families, I think, was mentioned. That's a very good idea. It's sort of challenging to know who that would be right at the beginning. I think we do have to remember throughout these discussions that all jurisdictions are not the same. Governance is not the same across the world. An authority standing in to speak for victims, families, in one part of the world might seem a completely neutral, just an unremarkable thing. In other parts of the world, that might immediately raise issues about, control. Who is trying to control the narrative? Is that really what you want? So there are no hard and fast rules for this. I think one just needs a bit of common sense. But as I said, the more sort of up to speed the media are in advance of how this roughly what is expected, I think the smoother it will be, if smooth is possible at all after an accident, but it will be going in that direction.
Bien. Thomas.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Although I'd just like to come in on this and say, in your situation, you'd say, like, right at the very beginning of a crisis situation, if we have an air crash, that what we don't have is any information. And what we may have are the testimonials of the victims or people in shock. Huh? And would it not be possible to have codes of practice to ensure that we don't turn this into a real circus where we hang the victims out to dry? Because when they really need the media At other points where they really need the media, then, the media are not on their side. Can we not kind of regulate this in some way?
Bueno,
Well, Thomas, perhaps, if you'd like to just, complete the tour de table.
In my view, there's an important element which is part of the planning phase, which if I look at my area of activity, airports, but aviation stakeholders have to have, and it was referred to in a number of the interventions too. Part of ensuring that that we can protect we can provide to start with information to families, and we can protect also their privacy and their taking care of their separation to a certain extent between the media and the families. It's important for us to have plans in place to be able to manage media. And as airport operators, we need to ensure that we have areas that are dedicated for those media teams which show up on site, and that we have appropriate measures in place to be able to keep separation between, in the end, families, the first responders too, and different airports personnel who may then be enticed to start providing information when it hasn't been validated beforehand. I think this is one of the big challenges that we certainly have to be faced with. I do like the idea of being able to provide a briefing to families, and I think as airport operators, this could be something which could be included in the plans which we have. As we are generally the first responders, so to speak, we're the first people on site taking action. This can be in support of the aircraft operator. But in some cases, the aircraft operator has virtually no personnel who's present, and it was referred earlier in the day of situations where it's a ground handling service provider who may take care of that initial interaction between the families and the aircraft operator. If there's only one duty manager, one station manager who's present, the airport then, of course, has an important role to play. And so in my view, that there would be a role that we would be able to have in order to, through our comms teams, provide this quick briefing to families in terms of being aware for some of the challenges and some of the risks related to those being launched onto the visible phase of the media, if you like. So I think it's certainly a good action that we can take out of this.
I'll just jump in quickly. I do sympathize absolutely with the idea behind this. The problem, as I said, is that aviation is a global industry, and there are enormously divergent attitudes towards information, towards the press, there are very broad issues behind this, and which actually go beyond my field of expertise, but press regulation is a huge topic in its own right. And what may seem like I can totally understand why it seems like a good idea, but spread across the world, spread across aviation, generally speaking, people, governments, authorities telling journalists what they can and cannot write and who they can and cannot talk to, it doesn't always end well, and it generally doesn't stop there. It usually opens the door to other restrictions which may not be appealing to everyone. It's a very political issue, and I think it tends to be sorted out at a national level rather than a sort of an industry-wide global level. But there are a lot of pros and cons on this. Having said that, it's incumbent on the press to show that they can raise to what the public expect of them and behave in a reasonable way. And as I said earlier, to be challenged when they don't. And I think one thing that does help is the more that competent authorities speak and can say something and fill that void after an accident, hold a press conference, say what you can say, explain what you can't say. Just give as much information as you can. I think that will calm some of the forces which drive people towards this very intrusive behavior. That might be a little idealistic, but I think it certainly does help.
So I fully agree with you, and we can speak without. So the more official information we could have, the more reduced would be the pressure on the other party of this tragedy that are the victims. So sometimes we look for the victims because we lack information, because we only have the heartbreaking testimony of someone who has lost their loved one, his loved ones, or even doesn't know whether he has love. I remember with the Spanair, because I was on the Iberia that landed immediately after, and the commander from Iberia was one that declared this. So, and everybody was conscious that an accident had taken place in Barajas, and shortly after, there was on the breaking news in a newspaper was published about the accident, that there may be some injured people, and then we had the chaos that also exacerbated the drama. But I continue to insist on it. So there are some aspects from the information point of view that cannot be clarified or are difficult to understand. So, but if we say nothing is not attending to the right of information and the need to know what has happened, so that it doesn't happen again. So, and this is the aspect of the victims, of the humanization of the victims. From the September 11 in 2001, we stopped seeing victims in the big disaster that occur in the world. So my question is, should we fully cancel or annul those testimonies, or does their testimonies help us humanize what's the balance here? And this is I conclude so that you can answer. Anyone can answer on this. I don't think the problem is being thoroughly in terms of information. On September 11, we didn't see victims, but we saw this on a loop, like a loop, or once and again and again and again. And this, the building collapsing, and sometimes we see these images again and again and again, the permanent reiteration of some images. And sometimes this should be a matter of the code of ethics. And if we repeat the same image again, where do we have the margins? Where do we have the ethics? Could we create a code to ensure the maximum respect for the victims of air crashes without restricting the interest to the information thoroughness? Sorry. So if you let me, I would tell you from my point of view with the families that have lost their loved ones in different types of accidents or crashes. And I have found, as Oti said before, I have found people who didn't want to be on the media, on the news, and we have to have common sense. If you approach someone and you know whether someone is appropriate to be in front of a camera, and sometimes we find people who want to talk to the journalist because they want to point out some responsibilities that may have had fatal consequences. Some people organize campaigns with the support of the journalists in order to look for some crashes or some airplanes that crash on the sea that has happened in the Canary Islands. We have to do this from the respect. We have to be respectful and try to distinguish who wants to speak and who doesn't want to speak. And they should not be the main roles even when they don't want to. Alexandra?
Translation. In my view, it's up to the news teams what editorial, what images they show and which they don't, and perhaps there's the ethical code of conduct and the where you cross the line. But in terms of actually hearing and interviewing people that are on the scene or whatever, I think to your point, it brings the experience of what happened. I think it's very much part of the story. I think it would be very strange and not balanced to not hear that and only have the view of a spokesperson from the authority, for example. So I think there does need to be a balance, but absolutely in terms of the images that are keeping kind of repeating and feeding the news, I think that's very much down to the news channel.
Yeah, I have to concur with my colleagues. I think there just needs to be more coordination between the media and the authorities responding to an incident. I just draw it back to the family and survivors, because if we take the example of the airport. So for colleagues who work in the airport, you typically have to set up a family friends reception centre. And that often becomes the first point for which the media will be aware of your incident. All of a sudden, you have an influx of families descending on your airport, and then you have an influx of the media. Now, at the point in which a family is coming across with the media is normally an extremely distressing time. So they've just becoming aware of the fact their loved ones may have just died. And we've seen the images from different incidences where families are literally breaking down, crying on the floor. And these images are flooding social media, flooding every news station, and ripping away the dignity of people involved in incidences. So I am fully aware of the need for access to information, but I think there needs to be safeguards. And I do think there needs to be a level of protection given to us as responders. Because if we're trying to uphold the integrity of an investigation and trying to do the best by family members and survivors, we're not all trained in being media savvy. We are responders. We're humanitarians. We want to do the right thing by family members. So I think there needs to be limits and control put on the access the media has onto the site. For instance, giving them access, but giving them controlled access, because we don't want to undermine an ongoing investigation. So I think these are just some of the things I'd like to sort of impress upon us as an organisation, as people who are within this industry, but also kind of understanding the absolute need for information to give into the public, and also transparent information. So I think what we have to come into an awareness about is having regular, systematic media conferences, allowing the media to have their days on site, allowing the media to have access to information about what is going on, keeping that regular, but keeping it consistent. That means all stakeholders, all people who are responding need to be singing from the same hymn sheet. Because what we typically will get in the response to an incident is that one party is saying another one saying another. And so it's not so much the media's spreading disinformation. We ourselves are not communicating in one coherent voice about what is the kind of the message we're trying to convey in terms of our own response. So I think that's something we have to learn as a group of individuals within this industry, about how to have one coherent voice, and then how to articulate that clearly and in a coherent manner to the media. I think that is the relationship that we need to sort of straighten out and get some level of code of conduct about, and also kind of leaning on how we manage information and choose to access information on social media. I think that's another important aspect of this piece.
Gracias. ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta? Vamos a terminar esta ronda.
I think we have a question, but so we will have to put an end to this. I think the creation of journalistic codes of ethics today, when we have a very precarious profession in journalism in Spain, this is almost utopia. So what would happen today if we repeat? Of course, we don't want it, but if we happen this again, so the journalistic routines would be different. Would we improve? Yes or no? Probably what we could control would be the terminology. So we have a website that would be able to handle information that could not handle the call center. I know that many airlines have a protocolized crisis plan, but I don't know whether they have an online crisis plan, because social media would have a role that they could not have in 2008, because we were starting with the social media. But from the mainstream media, I don't think that we would see many changes from what happened in 2008, and I'm very sorry to say so. Thomas, please, briefly.
A couple of words. I'd say, so to start with, testimonies are, to me, they're critical in bringing a human aspect to the story which is unfolding, and that's an element that we can't neglect. I like I'd like to respond on the question of how do we manage social media, because to me that's one of the key elements which we haven't unfortunately been able to touch on too much in this panel, but it is one of the elements which creates the biggest challenge for us. And I know that a lot of airports and, of course, aircraft operators, airlines, have very robust social media presence and very robust social media teams to be able to manage that flow of information. But the challenge that we have, again, is making sure that the information on social media is validated and is the right information, if I can say it as simply as that. And probably one of the easiest responses to that is to make sure that there is a presence on social media by the relevant authorities, by the relevant organization who is communicating in a particular situation. Because it would be very simple for myself to declare, or for me to declare myself the expert and start communicating on Twitter and say all sorts of things. But I'm not validated as an authority. I have no authority to do that communication. Yet, if the organization who does have that, and to use the example that was shown this morning, the NTSB, if that authority is the one who can communicate, they need to have a very visible and very straightforward presence on social media, so that becomes the main point of contact, the main stream of information, which is then picked up on by all other, by families and by all persons involved. I'll leave it at that, as I know we're a bit pressed for time. Thank you.
Sí. Tim. Gracias, Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas. Tim?
I really don't have anything to add to what Thomas has just said. I mean, I do agree that the more communication is done by competent people, the more it will stabilize the situation. And the more the flow, the balance of power, if you like, or of roles between the mainstream and social media is changing all the time. And really, social media is now an all-encompassing and enormous force out there. But clear, swift, factual, contexted briefings to media, which can then get picked up, relayed across social media, broadcast on broadcast TV. This tends to stabilize the whole atmosphere and calm everything down. Some of the terrible examples that we've heard, perhaps it's impossible to rule those out. There will always be people who are more ruthless than others in every profession. I deeply regret that anybody should be distressed by the behavior of a journalist. But the opportunity for that thrives in a vacuum, and it tends to fade in a context where there's more validated information available.
Gracias, Tim.
Thanks very much, Tim. Completely agree with you. Unfortunately, on social media, we often see that, ignorance has found its algorithm. And, I think the question that we've received is, because we know that once a news item starts to spread, Solidafattori says, on social media, it's really difficult to reverse the impact that's caused. What can we do to try to get the family's trust back after some fake news has been spread? Yeah, how can we get their trust back? That's a tricky one. Well, you can only get trust back using rigorous information, even if there's very little of it. Because if we have a crisis of reputation where nobody really knows what on earth's going on, if you've only just got one fact or two facts, you need to stick to them. Because otherwise you get a snowball effect and everything runs right out of control. Yes, anything else to add on this?
Pilar. Micrófono. Hay un micrófono.
Hello, we need the roving mic to be able to translate.
Ahora te traen el micrófono.
So the microphone's on its way. Small pause. Yes. 3 quick questions for Thomas. Why does ICAO, why has it not responded well to the questions? Why do you not implement the policy of assistance within its airporters? I know we're going to have to start bit by bit, but it's the victims that are asking ICAO to implement 9998. But there's a very small amount there on assistance to victims. And we know that, the passengers that are on board when there's a crash, we don't know one another. But whereas the people in the airports and the airlines, they know exactly who they are. And so the victims, in this case, we spent a whole year crying and trying to get information, and we couldn't get the information. Because if the organizations that are supposedly helping us, are in complete chaos, then it's the families at the end of the day can see that the only way that we can move forward is if we get together. Okay, a question for Odi. Kenyan International is a service company that is hired or taken on board in order to manage crises. Here in Spain, are you here? Is Kenyan International here, or has it now taken on a new form? In Spain, they've never dealt with any air tragedies. The information that I have had, that I've got about where Kenya has worked in other parts of the world, we know that you work hard on it, but in the end of the day, you have a contract that's worth X thousands of dollars or whatever, and you can't go over that amount. And we know that there have been times where Kenya has not been able to take on probably work that you'd like to, but there's no more money left. Is this information accurate? and is this true? Because, I'd like to be able to contrast this information. And then in the UK, to our UK speakers, since Lockerbie, we know that you learnt a great deal. And I don't think... I think that has been the biggest tragedy that you've had in the UK. And what did you learn from that? And what have you then been able to learn as lessons? Have you been able to fight to ensure what kind of progress you've been able to make? And what have you been able to roll out, actually put into practice as a result of those lessons learned? And I would like to propose that ICAO, with the 193 states and all the codes of practice, we know that it's really difficult to roll them out, but we think that in this symposium, we would like to propose that you could draw up guidelines so that journalists, if there's a tragedy, have guidelines where it says this is acceptable and that isn't. I mean, done in black and white. Okay, so on the 13th anniversary of the Spanair tragedy, that's 13 years of people who come every year, and we have to explain exactly what happened, through that fortnight. And we're absolutely fed up to the back teeth of it, frankly. And, we end up just, basically blacking them out, because at this point we really don't see why we should be explaining what happened again and again and again and again and again. So we'd like a code of practice. Thank you.
¿Quién contesta? Había cuestiones para Oti.
Who's going to answer? We had some questions for Oti, Alexandra, and Oti. Yeah. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por la pregunta. Creo que ha sacado algo muy interesante, y con respecto al Kenyon, tenemos una presencia sobre si tenemos hemos sido encontrados por varios operadores, y si tenemos algunos clientes españoles. Y
I would like to stress that the model for which Kenyan International work is probably something that people don't know about. So we're a disaster response organisation, and we respond to our clients who may hold and retain our services. So operators like yourselves in the room, and we will support you when there is an incident. But what we do have, in order to bolster and increase the level of capabilities to respond, is we have an international community of team members that would respond with us, because there's a small number of us who work full-time, where we have team members that specialise in recovery of human remains, in disaster victim identification, in humanitarian response, in crisis communication, in media response as well. And we would kind of activate all those individuals in order to respond to an incident. So in looking to your second point about that Kenyan has responded to incidents and would just stop if the money runs out, I would like to say that's simply not true. What we tend to do is that a service provider or an operator would contract our services, and that's separate. We have a number of services, such as disaster human services, crisis communication, and what will simply happen is that at the point of an incident, they would tell us what they'd like support with. Sometimes they'll say, we only would like you to support us with crisis communication. We'd only like you to support you with disaster human services, so looking after the families. Or we'd like you to manage the whole piece holistically for us and support us in navigating through an incident response. And we would do just that. We would actively support our clients in order to respond to an incident. But I just want to differentiate two things. So if we are looking at an aviation incident, we only would respond to a service provider who had contracted our services. Now, this is for a number of reasons, and it's not commercially driven, actually. It's actually just based on common sense rules. So if I'm going to respond and help you, I need to understand how you work as an organization. I need to train you. You may have some blind spots for which you need to bolster your capabilities. So we want to work with you in terms of reviewing your ERP. We want to work with you in terms of exercising out, because we have a saying at Kenny, we train as we fight. So we want to make sure that you're really stringently trained so you can meet the needs and the challenges that come with responding to an incident. So if someone called us up and didn't have a contract, we wouldn't respond for that very reason, because we want to know you personally. But we have responded to governments such as the UN or governments of countries who choose to activate our services, such as the response to the Boxing Day tsunami or to 9/11 or to the Grenfell fire. We were activated by governments who asked us, will you help us, support us in response to this mass fatality? And we have done so. Just kind of leading on one of your last points around the guidance given...
Con brevedad, Oti, que tenemos que irnos y todavía Alexandra.
Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you so much for your question. I'll answer it as best I can, but some of it I think may be lost in translation. So if I haven't answered exactly your question, we can talk afterwards. So in terms of lessons learned, so again, the UK Civil Aviation Authority, who I work for, are the regulator. So we implement the findings, we take the recommendations from the Air Accident Investigation Branch who do the investigation of the specific incident. So we then would take a safety recommendation, for example, and then translate that so it can then become policy. So in terms of Lockerbie specifically, I'm afraid I'm not across all the details, but I know that there were safety recommendations, security, communications, etc. So I can follow up with you to provide some more detail in terms of the UK and what we specifically learnt. From a communications perspective, just some reassurance. We all talk to each other in the UK, within Europe, globally through ICAO. So an example, I'm a member of an organisation called ECAC, which is the communications teams working in aviation across Europe. We've put together a code of conduct, a paper on best practice, how to deal with crisis scenarios, what you should do to be prepared, what the lessons learned are, and there are various kind of members signed up to how we do that. So with every incident, we're learning, we're improving, but we come together as a communications community to share that best practice as well as through more formal routes as well. Okay.
Bien,
thank you.
Pues muchas gracias, Alexandra. Y yo...
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And Pilar, I think that it is possible to design a code in order to balance from the beginning the information, interest, and the empathy, but the rigor is not only against the empathy. So Thomas, Tim, Teresa, Alexandra, Thomas.
Sí, que le había dirigido, perdón.
Too long.
No,
but
las pido yo.
I just wanted to come back on Pilar's question around airports. I think it's a very important question, and I agree with you. Airports can do more, and this is why we're here, and this is why ACI is engaged in these discussions with ICAO and with your association. Airports have a requirement to implement emergency plans, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow afternoon in block number 5. We have significant challenges still on a global scale to the implementation of emergency plans, and this is tied also to one of the challenges which has been identified by ICAO in terms of a process called the certification of aerodromes. There are still numerous aerodromes who are not certified by their states, and as part of that certification process, airports have to verify and make sure that they are compliant with the different requirements set forth by ICAO. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of regions where this is lacking. I do realize that and I mentioned it also in my intervention, even in the best planned airports and the best managed airports, the initial response to a major event is a significant challenge, and the resources are not necessarily immediately available. The activation of the emergency plan and the different cells which make up that emergency plan take some time, and of course the coordination across all the different organizations and entities who are responding to the event also takes time. In parallel to that, and this is what we've been talking about here, one of the big problems we have is that even as an airport operator, even if we're faced with and we're responding to the situation, we still don't have information available and can't communicate that information. And that information, to a certain extent, is also under the authority of or under the validation of other authorities. So we do have some challenges still to overcome, and as I said, that's why we're here to try and find the best solutions to be able to go forward. Thank you.
Bien, pues, ahora.
So now I think within a couple of minutes we have the bus is coming within a couple of minutes so that you can go back to the hotel, so we have to leave. I think we have still many ideas that are coinciding, and sometimes we don't have information. It is better to say that we don't have information than not giving information, because otherwise would be generating speculations, and companies are better prepared, and the more information that we can give, the more we can reduce the information on the victims of all the air crashes. And I think we still have to protocolize in companies working on this crisis situation. We still have to, so not at the beginning of a disaster. Of course, we cannot gather all the victims to tell them how they have to act. We cannot do that. But we think that we have some guidelines that we have to go deep into them, because the social media alters the ecosystem of the development on this type of crisis or air crashes. And what we have to do is to take advantage of the good parts of the strong points of the social media, or the good aspects of social media, in order to alleviate the tragic moment that is being suffered, in order to avoid the social media from poisoning the situation as it usually occurs. So how we manage the social media in the future, and how we build those spokespersons structure, how we can carry out develop a code of conduct in order to be respectful to the victims and the family. If we all work together in this direction, I think this is a bit what we have expressed, and we would be contributing to alleviate something that is very difficult to alleviate itself. So thank you very much for your attention.